This is the introduction to the big picture. 36 sessions to intellectual and spiritual clarity. And I'm going to begin by reading a quote from the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, a famous Kabbalist, an author, philosopher from the 18th century, lived in the 1700s. And as it says in the introduction to Derech Hashem, the Way of God, one of the main works of the Ramchal, that the Vilna Gaon, who lived just after, almost the exact same time period, mentions that if he could, he would have crawled on his hands and knees across Europe to sit and learn in the dust of the feet of the Ramchal. But he would have done anything he could. And of course, to appreciate what that means, you have to appreciate who the Vilna Gaon was, who the Gra was, because he was, of course, one of the greatest rabbis of the last couple hundred years. And aside from being a great source of halacha and piskei halacha, he was also one of the most important Kabbalists of the last couple hundred years. And for him to make a statement like that is a tremendous, tremendous statement about the Ramchal himself. So the Ramchal says the following thing in the introduction. He starts off simply, always, a tremendous anav. He's very extremely humble, and he doesn't want to give you the impression. You have to also know the historical basis for the Sforim that was coming after the time of Shabbatai Tzvi, the false Messiah. Kabbalah had kind of a bad name. Things were circulating about the Ramchal himself, things that he had said regarding Mashiach and Kabbalah. And therefore, he had to do whatever he could to hide the Kabbalah aspect of what he was saying. So if you know what he's actually saying, if you understand Kabbalah, you can read into his words and see the depth of his ideas and his explanations. But for the most part, Derech Hashem, the Way of God, is a hashkafic sefer. It's a philosophical sefer that basically organizes material, and he comes across at the beginning as if to say it's not so complicated, it's not so deep, but it's more to do with the fact that I've organized the material. But in fact, what he's saying over here is tremendously deep and profound, as the Ramchal always did. He says the following thing. He says, when one knows a number of things and understands how they are categorized and systematically interrelated, then he has a great advantage over one who has the same knowledge without such distinction. It is very much like the difference between looking at a well-arranged garden, planted in rows and patterns, and seeing a wild thicket or forest growing in confusion. The exact same flowers, the exact same trees, but it's not organized. It's Buckingham Palace versus some wild forest. At the palace, everything's organized beautifully, and there are the roses, the red roses, and the white roses, and different aspects, different parts of the garden. It's all organized so you can appreciate what you're looking at and how they grow and the difference between one flower, one species, and another species. But if you go to a wild growing forest, you'll see red coming out of here, white coming out of there, and though sometimes it might be very beautiful, it limits the ability to appreciate what you're in fact looking at. When an individual is confronted by many details, and that happens all the time in everyday life, and does not know how they relate to one another or their true place in a general system, so it's not just what you know, but how you know it and how you organize what you know, right? Inquisitive intellect is given nothing more than a difficult and satisfying burden. He may struggle with it, but he will tire and grow weary long before he attains any gratification. Each detail will arouse his curiosity, but not having access to the concept as a whole, he will become frustrated. So the Ramchal is pointing out an extremely important idea that even though we're bombarded by information on an all the time, ongoing basis, just because you know something doesn't mean you understand something. And even if you understand it on some level, it doesn't mean necessarily that you relate to it properly. And that will have a big difference on life. A major impact on a person's life. So he continues. It's all part of the Hakdam introduction. He says, the exact opposite is true when one knows something in relation to its context. In life, context makes a major difference. Seeing things juxtaposed provides a perspective on the situation or life in general that's invaluable. Since he sees it within its framework, he can go on to grasp other concepts associated with it, and success will bring him pleasure and elation. You'll enjoy the learning. You'll enjoy the intellectual exercise because things will start to light up and they'll make sense to you. And you'll be able to relate to the ideas and the concepts on a much higher level of understanding. And that brings pleasure, he says, and elation. Right? So he goes on to say, when one studies a subject, he must therefore be aware of the place of each element within the most general scheme. When one takes into account existence as a whole, everything, including everything imaginable, whether detectable by our senses or conceivable by our mind, meaning that not everything is visible to the physical eye, but some things are visible to the mind's eye. There are things that we can see in our imagination. And physics today, a large part, works this way. It's mostly theoretical, right? You can't actually prove, physically and see an atom and molecules, but we know they're there because our mind's eye tells us they have to be there, right? So then he recognizes that things are not all in the same category and level. People who don't understand life, don't understand what life is about, tend to clump ideas together. People lacking the kind of context that the Ramchal is speaking about over here, right? Because of the fact they lack context, they lack structure, they lack a misgeret, right? In order to comprehend the true nature of each thing, to understand something in life, he says one must be able to recognize these distinctions. So not just with ideas, but people as well, and situations, right? Context counts for a tremendous amount, and context requires structure, like an office, for example, where you have papers coming in all the time, and you have people producing things all the time. And if the situation is wild, and there's no real structure, no organization, no filing system, then nothing can really connect one to the other. Ideas just flow, perhaps, you can be productive to some degree, but there'll come a time when you acquire a certain piece of information, and there'll come a time when one idea is connected to another idea, but you won't notice that because they're not connected. There's no misgeret. There's no framework putting it all together. So, the Ramchal has provided a tremendous insight into how the mind works and how human beings relate to information. But, as we'll see very shortly, however, the Ramchal is also addressing a far more complex issue. Why there can be a difference regarding, right, belief in God. One of the most fundamental questions of history right now has to be, whether God exists or not. Science, and modern day philosophy has gone to extremes to most of the time just to prove that God doesn't exist, to prove that everything is quite mechanical. Even though we'll see very shortly certain quotations that seem to suggest, not just suggest, but say just the opposite, right? But the following article in 1992 in Time magazine was called "What Does Science Teach Us About God?" And of course, they had both sides of the story, both types of scientists, those scientists that believe and scientists that don't believe. And the article says the following thing. In short, the works of modern science, taken one by one, seem enough to dampen a person's hope for a higher meaning.